And a very pleasant good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Morning Briefing. I'm Jeff DeForest, and the red-hot man over there. I'm wearing my red shirt because it's like Tiger Woods' closing day for you, Mike Lubie. After that 4-0 week ago in the National Football League games. We'll get into the NFC title game in just a few minutes here on NoFilter.net and, of course, Caffeine TV. We welcome all the viewers and the ever-growing list of people, numbers of people that are tuning into the Morning Briefing. We greatly appreciate that. I don't know that Bill Belichick feels greatly appreciated at this point. How odd is this? There were 8 coaching vacancies in all in the National Football League, and the second winningest coach of all time. Just a few short right now. You have to feel like Belichick has a little bit of an obsession with closing out his career as the winningest coach of all time, exceeding that 347 victory total of the great Don Shula and the Miami Dolphins went undefeated in 1972. Belichick has had some great opportunities. He had a couple of interviews with the Atlanta Falcons. You thought there would be other teams that were interested. And yesterday, Lubi, I don't know how you feel about this, but if you're Bill Belichick and you're passed over for Raheem Morris, who, no disrespect to Morris, a lot of players around the league like him, great defensive mind, but as a head coach, a guy was like, 31-48? Something along those lines. You're Bill Belichick, Bill fucking Belichick for that matter. And you can't beat this guy out for a job? That's kind of like losing an election to George Santos or maybe a foot race to Fridge Perry. It's like Secretariat losing to a cheap claimer from Beulah Park in the prime of Big Red's career. Seeing Bill Belichick now with only 2 possibilities left because the vacancies are being filled, and they're being filled quickly, almost as if you were in South Florida in the middle of February and you were trying to find a cheap hotel. It's just not happening by the beach. And for Bill Belichick now, 2 opportunities left. One, he's not linked to at all, the Seattle Seahawks job. And the other, the Washington Commanders, you would have thought maybe he was a candidate there, but so far, not even a sniff of interest in Bill Belichick. Kind of surprising, you would have to think. Or are the teams just looking at Belichick and saying, you know what? Like the rest of the country that doesn't care for the Patriots, New England hates clam chowder. Are they just thinking that this guy is in the old Chuck Noll syndrome? The game has passed him by. I don't believe that. What do you think?
Well, but people we've talked to said he needs to move on from wanting personnel control, but they also said they didn't see how he would do that. Leslie Visser, a dear friend who had, I guess she's friendly with him. I mean, she's been covering him since he was well before he became.
She knows him on a different level. Yeah.
Well, she's been covering him since before he was anyone. So she's friend. I mean, she considers herself a friend with him. So she knows him well. She says he would understand and he would know he needs to divorce himself of those responsibilities. And she knows him better than I do, obviously. But from what we've heard, that's not the case on any level. That's why he liked Atlanta, because Arthur Blank supposedly really wanted Belichick, and that's something he really wanted was personnel, if not control, at least high involvement in personnel. Well, lo and behold, that seems to be the case, and that seems to be why NFL teams don't want him. Like, it's very clear that that doesn't work, number one, and it doesn't work for him, number 2. So it feels like, look, more. It's funny. Morris was very young when he got the Bucs job, and he actually, if people forget, I think the first year they made the playoffs or something like that, he was good for the first year or 2, and then he went off a cliff. It's been a long time. That was well before I started working with you. So, I mean, I think it's been well over a decade since then. He's been a DC a few times over, been really good as a defensive coordinator a few times over. So, I mean, if you're giving a guy a second chance, usually guys get a second chance right after failing. So at least it's been a long time. He's probably learned a lot, and he's been very successful as defensive coordinator since. And I don't think he even asked at all for personnel control. That's the problem with Belichick, is he's really set in his ways, and it's a different generation. Look, I'm sure he can still coach, but can he coach at the same level? No one knows. It's happened to all these guys, and I'm not going to say he's any better than the rest. Chuck Noll, Landry, George Allen, Don Shula, like they all hit a point where they get where it's harder to meet on the same level with the players. Look, it's happening right now with Vic Fangio down here in South Florida. By all accounts, if you look at what the Dolphins defense did, especially down starters, it was fucking masterful what Fangio did, right? Like versus the Bills, they only scored a couple touchdowns. One was a punt return. Remember, they only scored 14 points. Versus the Chiefs, the Chiefs only scored a couple times. Like the Chiefs didn't score a lot. So he was able to cover up for a lot of injuries, but on his way out, first of all, mutual parting of ways, and you're hearing players mock that his system was old and he was fucking old.
That was your theory. Yeah.
No, that's what Javon Holland's dad came out and said. All right, time to move on to a new era. Like
they're moving on in Philadelphia, with Fangio. So he managed to land in a spot where it seems like his services, if they're still as high and as qualified as people deemed them to be before this season, certainly would be merited and needed, because the Philadelphia defense inexplicably was a shell of what it was the previous year. Injuries notwithstanding, they still seem to have the personnel to be a lot better than they were, coughing up like 30 points a game. That was pretty ugly. So Belichick appears to be out as a head coach. Those two spots seem to be waiting, Washington and Seattle, for the conclusion of this week's games, maybe even the Super Bowl, to talk to some of the assistants on the teams, the last four teams that are standing, which we'll get into some analysis here in just a sec on the NFC title game. Although it does seem like the whole country is going Motown, man. The Tears of a Clown. They're all relating to the Detroit Lions, the blue-collar team, a bunch of misfits and cast-offs, with Dan Campbell as their head coach, a guy who makes Conan the Barbarian look like Prince Charles in terms of etiquette, and yet very well-liked and seemingly very down-to-earth when he's not holding a press conference or maybe trying to motivate his team by eating a live animal and castrating a bull in Jackie Sherrill fashion. Very, very well liked, Dan Campbell, and everybody around the country sort of admires his whole approach. And it is so befitting of the city of Detroit, especially going against that bastion of sophistication, San Francisco and the 49ers. I mean, when you look at it, right? Alcatraz versus the Wayne County Jail. The food they list as the top food coming out of Detroit, indigenous to Detroit, a coney dog, which they borrowed from New York City, for God's sake. I don't see any difference between that and going to Nathan's right there on the boardwalk at Coney Island.
It's the shitty Nathan. Remember, they made it the short, crappy dog with crappy chili.
Like the dogs that were rejected from Nathan's in Coney Island. They ship them to Detroit. Like they were the Texas governor, just shipping immigrants all over the country there. Right? Okay, here's the bus to New York, and this one's going to Chicago. That's got to be kind of wild. He's turned that into a bus terminal. But Abbott, as in Abbott and Costello down there in Texas. Yeah. But, when you look at Detroit versus San Francisco, those 7 points loom as being extremely tempting, do they not, Lubi? You would have to think that with Brock Purdy, if you were going to rate the quarterbacks that are left in the semifinal round now, going to the Super Bowl, you probably put Mahomes number one, even though Lamar Jackson's going to be the MVP, just based on experience and the fact that he has been so successful in the postseason, where Lamar Jackson is kind of proving that the short sample size that people were judging him by probably was, a little bit unfair to say that this guy was a playoff bust. Although he had not been good in the playoffs. People started putting pressure on him, keeping him in the pocket. And his arm, he has a strange throwing motion. It's not like the ball comes out of there like you're watching Dan Marino or John Elway. And yet, with his running game and his acumen for scrambling out of the pocket and making passes and plays on the run, I don't know. If you had one game to win, the old proverbial question, if you had one game to win, would you rather have Patrick Mahomes right now or Lamar Jackson?
I'd still rather Patrick Mahomes, but one game with the Ravens or one game with Mahomes with the Chiefs, I'd rather have Lamar Jackson with the Ravens.
Yeah. That's the old Shula thing they used to have in the press guide there. He can take, and it was a quote from Bum Phillips that still needs interpretation. He can take Hisn and beat Ewan, and he can take Ewan and beat Hisn. What the fuck are you talking about, Bum? Yeah, in other words, his implication was that Shula could win whichever side you gave him. He was going to be the better coach in the game. Maybe, is Lamar Jackson at this point comparable to Patrick Mahomes? If you were starting a team at this stage because of his youth and the fact that he's a guy that's on the come, he's on the rise, whereas what we've seen what Mahomes can do, would you rather have Lamar Jackson than Patrick Mahomes? Sort of a toss-up, although I think the solid resume of Patrick Mahomes probably makes him the number one guy that's left in the chase. Number three would be, for sure, Jared Goff. Yep. And you would have to put Brock Purdy at the very bottom, would you not, as your handicap in that game?
Yeah, by a lot. Like, he's a guy that is, again, he's the definition of game manager, and it's fine because they have a lot of talent. But as we've seen this year over last year, things have to be exactly right for him to be the guy that can win, because when anything's off health-wise, that team is night and day.
Yes, and Devo Samuel remains somewhat questionable, although, as we've often said here, if you look at the injury report in the National Football League, unless a guy is listed as deceased,
exactly,
he's playing. He may not play well, he may not play a lot, but he's going to be out there, Devo Samuel. And even as a decoy, he's an effective element and component of that San Francisco offense. I have to lean towards Detroit in this game, not just from a rooting standpoint, but because I believe that they can hang within a touchdown of the San Francisco 49ers. If the Packers were on the threshold, on the precipice of pulling off the major upset on the road, and the San Francisco 49ers, you would have to say that they were very fortunate. They did orchestrate that late drive that gave them the lead. There was still time left in the ball game for Jordan Love to bring the Packers back. He makes an horrendous decision at the end of the ball game and throws the ball while running to his right back into the middle of the field. I mean, you can't make a bigger mistake. It's kind of like saving a ball in the paint there and just tossing it out into the middle of the free throw lane. And it never works, seldom works. In this case, it just blew up in Jordan Love's face, much like it did for Baker Mayfield in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' effort to get to this stage. And late game interception, not exactly a resounding endorsement for the way that a guy has played throughout the ballgame. But by all rights, San Francisco should be on the sidelines in this one. Green Bay had him by the jugular. So the vulnerability of the San Francisco 49ers versus this wave of momentum that the Detroit Lions, imagine, I mean, the worst job that you could have had, we often talk about the worst job in all of sports, might be a scalper of tickets at a Marlins or a Tampa Bay Rays game. It could be, well, I mean, we've often deemed this, and if you've seen any documentaries on the breeding industry and horse racing, it would have to be the teaser horse on a stud farm, 100%. Would it not? But, I mean, it's one of the worst jobs that you could possibly have in all of sports, to be sitting there as a San Francisco 49er, trying to justify Brock Purdy, Mr. Irrelevant, to maybe about to become Mr. Irrelevant again. It's very possible that he does after this ball game, and we'll see what happens. Coaching matchup, kind of interesting. Dan Campbell, Mr. Rough and Tumble, and he's going against Kyle Shanahan, sort of an intellectual sort. Both of those guys are somewhat reflections of the cities that they represent as head coaches in the National Football League. But I just think Detroit can hang with the San Francisco 49ers, and if you forced me to make a wager on this ball game, I'm going to go ahead and take the points and figure that this game will be at least close. And there's little likelihood that the 49ers are going to blow the Detroit Lions off the field in this one. So I think I'm with you on this, Lubi, Mr. Perfection. I'm going to go ahead and put my money on the Detroit Lions to beat the 49ers and make their way into their first ever Super Bowl. And they haven't won a championship since 1957. Think about that. 1957. It was a different world in the National Football League in 1957. In fact, it was a different world, period. Imagine station wagons were in vogue. The Russians had just launched their first Sputnik. Dwight Eisenhower was the president of the United States. People were coming into some kind of a period of prosperity, at least a brief one, before all things started falling apart about 20 years later. But it was a good time to be around. I was 6 years old in 1957. Think about that. Here I am. You're looking at an old man, people. It's been a long, long time for the Detroit Lions. Maybe they're due. It's possible. But I do believe that they can hang with the San Francisco 49ers in this ball game, that the 49ers aren't blowing out anybody at this stage.
Well, that's my thing. Look, okay, if the Niners were 100% healthy and put everything together, look, and the funny thing is their defense hasn't been scary either. They added Chase Young, which was supposed to be one of the more ridiculous combos with Nick Bosa and Chase Young. They've been average. I mean, they haven't been horrible, but they haven't been getting after. Jordan Love did whatever he wanted in that game. I mean, he had 3 touchdowns going in to the end of that game when he sort of fell apart as a young quarterback. Like, that shouldn't have happened with Nick Bosa and Chase Young. Their linebacking core is as good as any in football. And their secondary is great, so they don't have to worry about, like, they can blitz, they can do whatever the hell they want because they can leave their secondary on an island. They haven't looked like that. So if they put it all together, they can. The Lions secondary is not great. That's their weakness. So yeah, with Kittle and Ayuk, who's become a legit number 2, might be a number 1 on a lot of teams. Healthy Samuel, McCaffrey, the way he can catch the ball out of the backfield. Sure, if they had all of them healthy, then yeah, they could put it on the Lions, but that's not what we've seen. And again, what we've seen from the Lions, what we talked about earlier this week, you talked about a little yesterday, is they rise to the occasion. No matter what's going on in the game, they're not just some team that sucked before and is good now. They actually have legit talent. It's not some guy doing the rah-rah bullshit. They have an offensive coordinator who's probably going to be a head coach next year. They have a defense coordinator who will probably be a head coach in the next couple of years. Their GM did a fantastic job using that Jared Goff trade to really rebuild the roster, offense and defense. The line, offensive and defensive lines are strong, and they have depth. So even when there's injuries, they can pick up for the guy who's out. I just don't see that 7 points is a lot to me. And it's annoying.
Looms large, yeah.
Because everyone's rooting for the Lions. I don't care about this game. I don't hate Shanahan's annoying, but I don't hate the Niners. And I don't.
You have to admire what they've done.
Oh no, I would. I'm gonna watching the game. I'll go, yay, Lions, because it's a cool story. But like, that has nothing to do with my play. The 7 points is a lot. This team finds a way to be in the game. They did it all year. Even when they lost games, they were in it. So, and the Niners are struggling. To me, it's easy. And I'm scared a little bit that everyone's on it. Like over the years, you don't want to. If you could book the media's action, you'd be rich. But and the public, if you could book the public, that's why Vegas is rich, because they book the public's action. It just feels like. And again, I was talking to our buddy the Greek, who is a handicapper and lives to talk to handicappers, and he said it does feel like a line where they're trying to suck people in to bet the Lions. It does feel like that. Okay, they sucked me in, like, because I'm all over the Lions.
That's okay. I don't mind being sucked into a winner. That'll be fine. I just believe that the game is more even than the point spread would indicate.
Yes.
And as you said, I mean, if Brock Purdy gets pressured and the Lions find a way to kind of compromise him a little bit and force him into some unfortunate quick decision making, they can easily be had. And it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if it's worth a taste on the money line, but it certainly is worth taking the 7 points. We did mention something yesterday on one of our shows, and I put this proposition in front of you. Would you take nearly 2-1 on Yannick Sinner, the young Italian, 21-year-old kid, 22 years old, I believe he is, against Novak Djokovic, who, again, was one of those guys like the San Francisco 49ers who had shown vulnerability so far in trying to defend 4 straight times that he was in the Australian Open. He had won 33 consecutive matches going into the match last night in the semifinals in the men's bracket. And what happens? He gets smoked by Yannick Sinner. Loses the first 2 sets, 6-1, 6-2. Comes back, and you're thinking, geez, this is a joker. It doesn't matter that he's down 0-2 and getting annihilated in the third set. Somehow finds his way to come back, win the tiebreaker, and then Sinner, to his credit, keeps his composure throughout. I mean, what the epitome of calm was never more on display than it was in this spot, as Yannick Sinner was trying to pull off the upset. Not a monumental one, but nonetheless, a 2-1 in a tennis match at this stage of the tournament. You would have to say that maybe that was worth a sniff. I tried to talk you into that, Lubie. Yeah, I tried to talk myself into it, and sure enough, a great victory there by Yannick Sinner in the Australian Open. So he makes his first ever Grand Slam final, and it looks like he's on the precipice of many more to come. He might have exceeded, at this point, he's playing better tennis than even the great young star Carlos Alcaraz, who got knocked out earlier in the tournament by Zverev, who, as we speak, as the airing of this original episode of the program here, was now involved in a 5th set against Daniil Medvedev. After taking the first 2 sets, Medvedev has come back and won a couple of tiebreakers. So they're going to a 5th set, which is not uncommon in this year's Australian Open. Just unbelievable action taking place there. And now, prior to that, I was watching the semifinals last night, and they had South Carolina going against LSU in women's college basketball.
This was a big game. Are they the 2 best teams? Is that what I'm missing? Like, I saw people, like dudes on Twitter, talking about this game, and I'm like, what?
Well, you had the undefeated number 1 ranked South Carolina Gamecocks, coached by Don Staley, and they're going against, I guess, LSU might have been number 2. They're certainly a top 5 team.
Title or something. Yeah.
Kim Mulkey comes in there dressed like Ric Flair. I don't know what her story is. She seems like an insane woman. Is it necessary to scream at players all the time? Lubie, have you played for a coach that was just constantly screaming? That I thought that was no longer in vogue.
I never had that, and I've never done it. I only, my kids, when I've coached, I scream so that they can hear me when they're at the other end of the floor. Yeah. But like when they're here coaching, I mean, I've only coached 10. Well, I've coached 16-year-olds. I don't understand the screaming. The kids don't listen to that. Kids don't give a shit about. If you're screaming at them, they tune you out. From what I've learned.
It's crazy, yeah. Plus, I mean, now that they're making millions of dollars, I mean, you think yelling at Caitlin Clark is going to do any good. She could buy and sell the entire franchise with all the name, image, and likeness money she's making. In fact, it's funny, too, because it used to be that a college player couldn't wait to have eligibility to go pro. And now you're better off trying to figure out if you can get that 8th and 9th year of eligibility to stay in college. Because you're going to have to take a pay cut, especially if you're talking about what's going on with women's college basketball for the top players versus going to the WNBA, where we know that salaries are so limited that a lot of the women that play in the WNBA end up with an unfortunate circumstance for Brittany Griner, certainly. But, they end up having to play in Europe and supplement their income. It's just not enough to carry them, the limited salaries in the WNBA, which now pale in comparison to what some of these girls are making as college players. But, LSU and Kim Mulkey, she does seem like she's having some kind of psychotic episode with virtually every moment of the game that passes. And South Carolina rallied in that game, came back. They were trailing throughout most of the ball game, came back in the fourth quarter, and remained unbeaten at 18-0 as they handed LSU their third loss of the season. All right, a lot of fun being with you. Good luck, everybody. Should be a very enjoyable weekend. We'll join you again on Monday. We'll have our in-depth analysis, our dissection of what we figure is going to be, could easily be, 2 losing efforts here. I do believe the Ravens will cover. It's now a 4-point game. I think they'll cover that. That doesn't scare me. That hook, you might want to buy the hook. But maybe you buy a point in that game and figure the Ravens are at least a field goal better than Kansas City. And then we're going to go with Detroit. We're going to ride the wave of momentum. Blue collar versus high tech. It's lack of intelligence versus artificial intelligence. It's incredible what's on the line in this game. City versus city. And what it represents. But I'm going to ride the wave of momentum and the country's momentum that is solidly behind the Detroit Lions and the Cinderella story, and go ahead and take the 7 points against the San Francisco 49ers and try to make a score. We'll talk about that on Monday. Thanks so much for joining us here. Have a great weekend, everybody. For Mike Luby Lubitz, I'm Jeff DeForest, and that's today's edition of the Morning Briefing.